In this video we're gonna implement shooting, reloading, and a bullet counter that displays our ammo. We're gonna start this episode by importing all the assets that we need, so let's go to the asset store and let's search for UniRx first. Once you find it, add it to your assets and then press open in Unity, and the package manager should open up automatically in your project. Once you see this window and you see the UniRx package, press download and then press import. When the import window pops up, you can just uncheck the examples folder because we won't be needing that unless you want to check it out for yourself. Once it's done, let's go to the asset store again and search for DoTween. Open the free version and repeat the same process that we did before. Once the import process is done, you're gonna see a window that's gonna tell you that DoTween setup is required. So first let's open the DoTween utility panel, then press setup DoTween, then wait until Unity compiles all the scripts. Once the check marks become available, let's uncheck audio, physics, and physics 2D. We'll only need the sprites and UI module. When you're done, just press apply. Alright, now let's just close this window, the package manager as well, and let's get to coding. First of all, let's open the scripts folder and create a new folder called shooting. Then open it, and inside it let's create a new script called gun controller. Now let's select the player object, attach the script, and open it right away. First of all, delete all the code that we don't need. Next up, let's put the script inside the top-down.shooting namespace, just to keep everything clean and to maintain good practices like we did from the beginning of a series. We'll need a couple variables to get things started. First of all, we'll need a couple of floats to handle the cooldown, then we'll need a game object for the bullet prefab and a transform for the shoot point. Let's start with the cooldown. First of all, let's create a header, we're gonna call it cooldown. Then underneath it, let's put a private float called the same, only with an underscore letter. We're gonna use this variable to determine how much time needs to pass between shots. So let's serialize the field so we can tweak this later in Unity. Next up, we'll need another float, which is gonna be used to count how many seconds have passed since the last shot. We're gonna call this one cooldown timer. Before we continue, let's also set the default value of the cooldown to 0.25 seconds. And now we can create an update method where we will increment the cooldown timer by time.deltaTime. So basically, when the game is running, this timer will be increasing. We'll also need a private method for shooting, so let's create that. And inside of it, first of all, we'll check if enough time has passed since the last shot. We're gonna do this specifically by checking if the cooldown timer is smaller than the cooldown. In this case, we're just gonna return. This method is not gonna do anything because not enough time has passed. Now we need to call this method from somewhere. And if you think about it for a bit, it should happen when we receive the right input. So for this purpose, let's create a new region for the input, and inside it we're gonna put a private void called onShoot. Alright, now let's get back into Unity and make sure that the player input has the shoot action. So let's make sure that the player object is selected, then open the player input action asset. Now let's create a new action, we're gonna call it shoot, and for the binding we're gonna select the left mouse button. This is gonna work with a mouse, obviously, but if you wanna make it work with a gamepad as well, you can add another binding. So for this binding, let's open the path, choose gamepad, and personally I think button south is the best fit since we don't have a jump in our game. Great, now it's gonna work with a gamepad as well, so let's save the asset and get back into the code. Now inside the onShoot method, which is gonna be called by the input, we're gonna call the shoot method. Then let's just use debug.log to output a simple statement to see if this works. Then after that, let's not forget to reset the cooldown timer to 0. Alright, let's go back into the editor and see if this works. And as you can see, every time you press the left mouse click and enough time has passed since the last shot, you will get a message in the console. So that's great, let's continue. Our shots currently don't do anything, so next up let's implement an actual bullet and a visual effect. First of all, I'm gonna create a header which is gonna be called references. Then underneath it we're gonna put a private game object called bullet prefab and a private animator called muzzle flash animator. And we're gonna serialize both fields. And now instead of just debugging a message, we can actually use the muzzle flash animator to set a trigger called shoot and instantiate an object for the bullet. Next up, we'll need a position and a rotation for our new bullet. For this purpose, let's create a private transform called firepoint, which is going to be attached to the player, and we're just going to take its coordinates and assign it to the new bullet object. Now inside the instantiate method, we're going to pass in the firepoint position, the firepoint rotation, and for the last argument, which is the parent transform, we're going to pass in null for now. Now let's get back into Unity and create the firepoint object. Select the player in the hierarchy and create a child object for it. To make it more visible, you can assign an icon to it, then just take it and drag it to where the barrel of a gun is located. It's important here to make sure that this point is positioned outside the player collider, so that you avoid accidental collisions between the player bullet and the player itself. When you're happy with the position, you can just rename the object to firepoint, then drag it underneath the torso object, because if you remember, our torso is responsible for the player rotation. Next up, let's create another empty game object, and also let's position it as a child of the torso object. This one is going to be called muzzle flash animator, and obviously it's going to be responsible for playing the muzzle flash animation when we shoot. We're going to need two components on this object. First of all, an animator, and secondly, a sprite renderer. Once you have them, let's select the sprite, and coincidentally the one that we need is exactly on the top when you open the selection window. It's called 1 and it looks like a small fire. After you set it, let's also go inside its folder, select all the sprites, change the pixels per unit to 16 and the filter mode to point. Then press apply. You're gonna notice that the sprite is still not visible in Unity, but if you select the object in the hierarchy, you're gonna see an outline. So first of all, let's change the sorting layer to player, and then because the object is too big, let's also reduce its scale to 0.2 on all axes. You're also gonna have to play around with the position, set it so it matches the sprite of a pistol. Alright, now let's go into the animation folder. First of all, let's create a new folder for the legs and drag all the legs animation in there. Then let's create a new one for the muzzle flash. Then go inside it and create an animator controller called muzzle flash as well. Once you have it, just select the muzzle flash animator object and drag the animator into the controller field. Now let's go into the animation window and let's create two animations here. First one is going to be called muzzle flash underscore idle. And for this one we have to press the red record button, then go into the sprite field and set the sprite to none, because obviously by default the muzzle flash shouldn't be playing. Then let's create the second animation, which is going to be called muzzle flash underscore shoot. For this one we're going to have to animate the sprite as well, so let's press the red record button, then go into the sprite selection window. For the first frame, let's select the first sprite, then let's take the project window and drag it a bit up so you can see both the project and the animation window simultaneously. Then let's go to the second frame, which is going to be at 5 milliseconds, and let's drag in the second sprite. Then at 10 milliseconds the third sprite, and finally for the last frame select none so we don't have a sprite at all. We're done with the muzzle flash animations. Now we can drag the project window back and open the animator window so we can take care of the transitions. First, let's create a transition from idle to shoot, and as a parameter for it, we're going to create a trigger called shoot. Once you have it, assign it as a parameter, then open the settings, set the exit time and transition duration to 0, then disable the has exit time condition. Next, let's create the transition from shoot back to idle. For this one, leave has exit time enabled, then set the exit time to 1 and the transition duration to 0. Alright, that's it for the muzzle flash. Now let's select the player object and drag in all the references. First of all, drag the fire point, then the muzzle flash animator. Alright, now let's go into the assets folder and create a new folder for the prefabs. We're gonna put our bullet prefab in here. Next, let's go into the script shooting folder and create a new script called projectile. This is going to contain all the code related to activating and moving our bullets. Now let's create our bullet object. Let's go into the hierarchy, press right click, then go underneath 2D object, sprites, and then choose square. First you have to adjust the size because right now it's way too big, then let's change the sorting layer to player. We will also need to detect collisions with this object, so let's add a box collider 2D component. Then continue tweaking the size until the bullet looks right to you. Remember, don't make it too small because we actually need to see it in the game. Then let's change the color of a bullet so that it fits the muzzle flash. Then enable is trigger on the box collider component. Next, we also need a rigid body 2D component on it, and finally let's add the projectile script. Then right away let's open it and remove all the code that we don't need. Then let's also add the script to the top-down shooting namespace and use a require component header to make sure that we have a rigid body 2D component on this object. Alright, now let's start adding all the variables. First of all, we're going to need a private rigid body 2D component, as I mentioned, which is going to be called body. Then let's create a header for all the movement stats. Underneath this one, we're going to have a private float for the speed and another one for the lifetime. The lifetime is going to represent how many seconds the bullet will be active before we deactivate it. Let's also serialize these two variables so we can tweak them later. Next up, let's create another float, which I'm going to call lifetimer. And this is basically the timer that's going to count how many seconds the bullet has been active. Now let's create an awake method, and inside it we're going to assign the body variable by using getComponent. Next, we will need a public method called shootBullet to actually activate the bullets and make them move in the right direction. This method will take in a transform parameter called shootPoint. This parameter will be used to assign the position and the rotation that we need. Now, the first thing that we will do inside this method is take the reference to the rigid body and use add force to make it move. As the direction vector, we're going to use -transform.up multiplied by speed, and that's because the green arrow in Unity represents transform.up. And we want to move the bullet in the opposite direction. And as the second parameter, we're going to use force mode 2d.impulse because we want to add this force instantaneously rather than over time. Great, now let's take care of the lifetimer. For this, let's create an update method where we will increment the lifetimer by time.deltaTime on every frame. And when this lifetimer exceeds the value of the lifetime, in this case we're going to disable the game object. We do this because some bullets will not hit their target and will fly off infinitely unless we disable them. Alright, now in the shootBullet method, let's make sure to reset the lifetimer to 0 and the body velocity to vector 2.0. And then let's assign the position and the rotation of this transform to be the same as the shoot point position and the shoot point rotation. And finally, let's activate the bullet object. This is not going to be useful right now because we are going to instantiate and destroy our bullet objects, but in the future when we implement object pooling, it definitely is going to be. Alright, now we can go back into Unity and assign a speed of 10 and a lifetime of 5 seconds to our bullet. Once you have that ready, you can rename the object to player bullet, then go into the prefabs folder and drag it in here. Don't pay attention to this bullet object, I created it accidentally. Alright, now in here let's create another folder called bullets and drag the player bullet in there, because later on we're gonna have multiple prefabs, so let's keep everything organized. Now we can select the player object and drag in our new prefab into the bullet prefab field. Now we can delete the player bullet object from the hierarchy and let's open the player bullet prefab so we can tweak some rigid body parameters. In here we want to change both the gravity scale and the angular drag to 0. Then let's open the gun controller script and make a small addition before we can test everything we just added. And in here, right after we instantiate the new bullet, let's use the getComponent method to get access to the projectile script and call the shootBullet function by passing in the firepoint transform. That should be it for this step. We can finally go back into Unity and test everything we just did. As you can see, the muzzle flash animation is playing properly, the bullets are being instantiated and they are flying in the right direction. So, great job, let's move on to the next step. Now we need to handle the ammo logic and display the information about the bullet somewhere. So, first of all, let's create an empty game object and call it UI. Now let's right click this object and create a canvas as a child. We're gonna call this one UI canvas, and then I'm gonna take the event system and drag it as a child of the UI object as well. Let's also make sure to press this button to update the input module to the new input system. Next up, let's select the UI canvas object and make sure it is scalable. As a reference, we're gonna use 1920 by 1080. Now let's double click the canvas object and right click it to create an UI image as its child. We're gonna call this object stats panel because it's going to display ammo, armor and health later on. Once you're done, make sure to go to the link in the description and download this image because I forgot to include it in the pack. Once you have it, take it and assign it to the source image field. Then make sure to enable preserve aspect, then dock the image in the lower left corner of the screen. Good, once you've done that, let's go into the UI folder and change the filter of all the sprites to point. The pixels per unit we're gonna leave at 100 though. When you're done, press apply. Now I'm gonna play around with the size and the position for a bit, so you can pause the video and implement what looks best for you. But if you want to use my values, here they are. Alright, let's continue. Next I'm going to create an UI image and add the gun sprite to it. And finally an empty object for the ammo counter, which we're gonna position on the upper part of this image. When you're done, let's add a horizontal layup group component to it. I'm gonna explain why in a second. Then let's set the child alignment to middle center. Now when we create a child image, you're gonna see that it's gonna be positioned right in the middle. This is our ammo icon, so make sure to drag the correct sprite in here, then enable preserve aspect and pick a size that you like. Then we're gonna create another child object, and this one's gonna be a text mesh pro. When this window pops up, press import TMP essentials. This is necessary. Now let's start editing the text box and the rect transform. And I'm just going to speed this part up because obviously it's up to you to make it look good. Now I would like to change the font because this one doesn't fit our game. So check the link in the description, download the font, then import it into the assets and create a new folder for the fonts. Then just take the font, drag it into this folder. Then let's go to Window, Text Mesh Pro, Font Asset Creator. And we're doing this because we need to generate a TMP font asset. A simple font will not work. Once you see this window, take your font and drag it into the source font file. Then press Generate Font Atlas. Great, now the font asset is ready, so we need to scroll down, press Save As and choose a folder. Perfect, now we can choose our text object and drag our new font asset into the font asset field. As you can see, the text is looking much better now. Next up, we need to go into the scripts folder and create a new folder for the UI. In here we need to create a new script called ammo counter, which is obviously going to be responsible for showing how much ammo we have in the gun. Now let's select our ammo counter object and attach this script to it. And if you also want to be a perfectionist like me, you can spend some time to rename the text object to ammo counter text and the image object to ammo icon. And finally, let's open the script and do our usual routine. First of all, delete everything, then let's put this script inside the topdown.ui namespace. One thing that we have to consider in here is that when we're using TM-Pro objects, we need to include using TM-Pro, so don't forget to do that. The only variable that we'll need in here for now is a private text mesh pro GUI called ammo counter text. Then let's serialize the field. To update our ammo counter, we will create a private void that will be called the same, update ammo counter, which will take in two integer parameters. Inside the method we're gonna say ammo counter text equals to this expression. And if you're wondering what the $sign does, it's basically a shorthand for string.format, which allows us to pass in variables inside curly brackets and they will be converted to strings right away. So let's say for example that the current ammo is 10 and the clip size is 20, our ammo counter will display 10/20. Right, and we also have an error here because I forgot to put .text after ammo counter text. Okay, we're done with the script for now. Let's go to the gun controller script and add all the ammo logic. First of all, we want to make sure that we include using UniRx at the top of the file. Then we should be able to create a public int reactive property called total ammo. And right away let's set a public getter and a private setter, so that other scripts can get access to this value but can't modify it. Great, now we need another one, so you can just go to the end of a line and press Ctrl D to duplicate it, and we're gonna call this one current ammo in clip. Naturally, you might have a question about what is an int reactive property. In this case, we're gonna use it as an integer value, but with a very useful option of letting listeners subscribe to it. So our ammo counter will update itself when one of these values will change, and it will do so only on that frame, rather than doing it continuously inside the update method. It's a very clean way to do it, and it's also great for the game's performance. Alright, enough talking, let's continue. Our next step will be to create an awake method. In here we're gonna say that the total ammo equals to the initial ammo, because this is right at the beginning of a game, so it makes sense. You'll notice that we have an error here, and that's because unlike normal integers, here we have to type .value to change the value of an int reactive property. And immediately let's do the same for the current ammo in clip value. But let's consider a scenario here. At the beginning of a game we might have more total ammo than fits into one clip. So to solve this potential problem, let's add an if statement here. First of all, we're gonna check if the initial ammo is smaller or equal to the clip size. In this case, we're gonna leave the same statement. Otherwise, if the initial ammo is bigger than the clip size, we're gonna set the current ammo in clip to the clip size. Now, since we added the ammo logic, we need to consider it in the shoot method as well. Specifically, if we don't have any ammo in the clip, we need to return here and not do anything. Then, at the end of the shoot method, let's make sure that we decrease the current ammo in clip by 1. Now let's go to the top of the script and instantiate our properties, otherwise we're gonna get null reference exceptions. Now we can go back into the ammo counter script and we're gonna create an onEnable and onDisable method to subscribe and unsubscribe. We will also need access to our int_reactive properties, which are located in the gun controller script, so let's make a reference to that. Your Visual Studio might not recognize the script. In this case, make sure to include the top-down shooting library, which is gonna solve the issue. Alright, now we have all the references that we need. Let's also create 2 private integers, one for the ammo in clip and one for the total ammo. And here I realized that I was a bit of a dumbass and we don't actually need to display the clip size on the counter, but rather the total ammo, so let's make that change. Alright, now let's actually subscribe to our int_reactive properties and update our counter. For this, first of all, we'll need to include using UniRx. Then bear with me. The code is gonna look a bit complicated, but its function is actually pretty simple. First, we're gonna type guncontroller.currentAmmoInClip, because that's the reactive property that we wanna subscribe to. Then we're gonna type observe every value changed, which is gonna give us access to the property's value when it is changed. Then we're gonna type property, lambda operator, then property.value, which means we want to observe the property's value rather than anything else. Then let's say .subscribe, open parentheses, value, lambda expression, followed by this block of code. If you never worked with UniRx before, you might look at it and think this is gibberish, but basically what this code does is it takes the current ammo in clip from the gun controller, it assigns it to our local variable, and then it updates the ammo counter. Once we use this syntax a couple more times, you're gonna get used to it very quickly. And now we can just copy paste this part and do the same thing for the total ammo. I also prefer to format it like this, but that's just my OCD, it's not necessary. Great, we're done with the subscription. Now let's figure out how to unsubscribe. Now we need a private composite disposable variable called subscriptions. This is basically a container where we add all of our subscriptions. Now, right after we subscribe to the current ammo in clip and to the total ammo, we need to add this line of code that says add to subscriptions. And as you can figure out, it basically takes this subscription and adds it to our container. My tongue's already getting twisted from saying subscription too many times. Now make sure to do the same thing for the total ammo. Awesome, now inside onDisable you can just say subscriptions.clear and it will take care of everything. Now let's go to the top of the script and let's make sure that we create a new composite disposable like we did with the int_reactive properties. Otherwise we're gonna get null refs. Now let's go back into Unity and assign all the variables that we need for the ammo counter. Alright, next up let's select the player object and set the initial ammo and clip size. I'm gonna go with 20 and 10. And now if you hit play, our counter should finally be working properly. We do have an issue though. When our current ammo and clip reaches 0, we can't shoot anymore, so let's quickly implement reloading. Let's go back into the gun controller script, and right after the shoot method let's create a new private void called reload. The first thing that we're gonna check in here is if we have any ammo at all. If we don't, we're just gonna return. Next up, let's create a local integer variable called reload ammo, and you're gonna see why in a second. We have two scenarios here. First of all, if our total ammo is bigger than the clip size, that means we can reload the entire clip. But in some cases you might just have a couple bullets left. In this scenario we're gonna reload how many bullets we got left. I hope this makes sense. And finally, at the end of the method we need to increment the current ammo in clip and decrease the total ammo value. Now we need to call this method, and exactly like the shoot method, this one's gonna be triggered by a certain input. So let's go into the input region and create a new private void called onReload. And inside of it just call the reload method, exactly like we did with the shooting. Great, now we can go back into Unity, open the player input asset and create a new action. Naturally, it's going to be called reload, and our first binding will be the R key on the keyboard. Then if you want to use a gamepad, you can also add another binding. Personally, I used button west. Perfect, let's save the asset, exit the window and press play to see how it works. As you can see, reloading works, but there is a problem. If we got any bullets left in the clip, when we reload we're gonna have more ammo in the clip than the possible clip size. And that's neither realistic nor fun, because the player will be able to abuse that. The fix is simple. Let's go back into the gun controller script and let's create a new integer variable called missing ammo. This one's gonna be equal to the clip size minus the current ammo in clip. We can also move this code a bit up before we calculate the reload ammo, because if we're not missing any ammo in the clip, we can just return. And now let's take this missing ammo variable and use it to replace the clip size in the if statement below. Alright, let's see if that fixed the issue. Perfect. As you can see, we only reload the amount of bullets that we need, and the same amount is subtracted from the total ammo. Finally, let's move on to the last feature of this tutorial, which will be to add a small pop-up effect to the ammo counter to attract the attention of the players. So to start things off, let's go to the ammo counter script and add using dg.twinning, which will allow us to use DoTween. We'll add this effect inside the update ammo counter method by using transform.doPunchScale. If you take a look at the description, this method increases the scale and then returns it back to the starting one, giving us a nice pop-up effect. But before we finish the implementation, we'll need a couple variables, so let's go to the top of the script, create a new header for the references, and another one for the pop-up effect. And the second one will be a private float called pop-up duration, and let's serialize both of them. Alright, now let's take them and pass them into the doPunchScale method. One cool thing with DoTween methods is that they have an onComplete event that allows us to do something once the doPunchScale method finishes. And here we want to pass in a method that will use the transform.doRewind function. Using this is not necessary, but I found that if we use doPunchScale very often, sometimes your transform might become too small or too large. So doRewind will make sure that nothing weird like this happens. Alright, that's it. If you go back into Unity, this is the result that you should get. I want to point out that the fact that we are instantiating bullets is not okay, it's not a good approach, and we actually need to implement object pulling, but let's keep that for another video, because this one has gone on long enough. To cap things off, I want to thank everyone for watching and wish you a Merry Christmas with your loved ones. As always, a huge shout out goes out to all the channel supporters: George Mulcahy, Patrick Getchell, Kenneth McGuinness, Brian Cahill, Enrique Machuca, Jason Wood, and PD100 Academy of Art. You're all amazing. Thank you and see you in the next one.